Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today it is the 28th of September, and I'm gonna be splitting this video up into two parts. The first part will be about the front lines. That should be pretty quick, and then the second half should be about the politics that occurred today, specifically with the referendums and some of the laws that are being discussed in Russia itself. But let's get into the front lines now. There were rumors on the Russian side that Ukraine is trying to launch another operation into the Kinburn Spit, which is over here. I'm circling it. So previously, they had reported that there was a failed assault by Ukrainian special forces on this spit, and that the Russian VDV troops were able to push them back using artillery and repel their helicopter assaults. So now they're saying that they've come back for more, and that there are two battalions being set up to enter the spit and advance all the way towards the Dnieper River over here and disrupt Russian supply lines even more by entering these towns and just disrupting supplies in general. So that's something to look out for. We never really had evidence of the first assault on the spit, but who knows what happened there. Here in Nova Kakhovka, there is new satellite imagery which shows that the Nova Kakhovka bridge is still damaged, but there's repairs going on right now. It was previously targeted by HIMARS and was very heavily damaged, but it seems as if it's still standing to a certain extent, so it could be repaired. In the meantime, there are two bridges that were set up over here to transport some of the heavier equipment, but they are susceptible to strikes by Ukraine, so it's possible that we'll see these two being attacked in the near future. Last thing from the Kherson region that I want to mention is that I added in some geolocations from Pravdina to show that the Russians still control the town, just to show that there was a failed Ukrainian assault. They sent some columns in 4 days ago. I talked about it several times, and they were just pushed back by Russian artillery. Now, let's move on to some other sectors. Specifically, I want to talk about Bakhmut, where I did make some changes to the map. First of all, I now show that the fighting is going on closer to Kurdyumivka, and also I made some adjustments over here near Bakhmut suburbs itself. So here you have the asphalt concrete plant, and the asphalt plant, it was said to be under Ukrainian control, but I did read some Russian sources that were saying that it was under Ukrainian control, and then the Wagner troops stormed it today. I'm not sure because it just came from some very unverified sources. But since this is a pretty minor area in the grand scheme of things, it is possible that it was just not mentioned by any of the major sources because it's not that important. I don't really know, but you can see here clearly that there is a plant, and the fighting is very close to this area. So I just moved the front line to indicate that. And then we don't know yet if Jovanka is actually under Russian control. If it were to be under their control, then they would just be able to push into Azaryanivka already. So I am not sure what's going on there. I'll give updates once I actually find some elaboration on the situation over there. Let's move on to Kupiansk, where we have new reports specifically from this French site called Le Monde, and they're saying that the fighting continues in eastern Kupiansk, that Ukraine launched some renewed assaults across the Oskil River into this area. There were Russian reports saying that the Kraken battalion was advancing into eastern Kupiansk, and that now there's engagements going on, that Russia is still keeping their positions in the city. They're not trying to withdraw or anything. So it's contested at this point, which is why I'm keeping Russia as under still present in the eastern part, although it's possible that you have small units of Ukrainians crossing the river and committing acts of sabotage on the Russian lines over here. That's entirely possible because the river is not that wide over here. Even if a pontoon bridge is not set up, they can cross with boats and stuff. So that's all we know now, but at least today I heard that the fighting was more intense around here. and that Ukraine is potentially try to start a new breakthrough over here and then push down towards the other urban areas around here. You have a train station, which is very important for Russian supplies, right next to the front lines right now. This station over here in eastern Kupiansk, Zaporizhzhia station, and that goes further south into this suburb of Kupiansk. So that's probably a part of Ukraine's strategy right now. Last thing about the front lines is that it was reported by both Russians and Ukrainians that there was a attempted Russian strike on this dam over here, the Becheny Dam, and there were some like conflicting reports. The general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces said that the Russians failed at this attempt, but then the regional government said that there was a possibility of emergency floods going on in this region because of the Russian strikes. And I'm not sure if these were airstrikes or artillery strikes. It could be like some MLRS, like tornado system that was used to attack the dam, but we're not fully sure of the extent of the damage just yet. It could cause some significant flooding though in this region, which is important for like the supply lines for the Ukrainians on the Oskil front right now because of how close it is to Chuhoiv, which is a key supply node for the Ukrainians. So that's really it in terms of the front lines. Now we're going to actually get into the referendums. So about 14 hours ago, the LPR actually announced that they would be holding a referendum on reunification with the Russian Federation. This was said by the head of the LPR, Leonid Pasechnik, and it's going to be from September 23rd to 27th, the days of the voting. And there's actually going to be a school holiday from the 22nd to the 28th, so more residents will have the ability to go out and vote in the polls. So the Russian Central Election Commission, they're the body that's organizing all of these referendums, and it really started with the Lugansk region, but then afterwards we had news from the DPR region where Denis Pushilin, he submitted a law to the parliament of the DPR, and then a few hours later they approved of it. So now it's also official that in the DPR they'll be holding the referendum on the same exact days. Then we had got news from the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts of their approval of the referendums being held on the same exact day. And specifically in Kherson, the Russian installed leader over there, Volodymyr Saldo, he said that he'd begin to set up a army for Kherson, which would be filled with volunteers first of all. So that's interesting. And of course, once the referendum occurs and if all of the oblasts vote to join Russia, which I think regardless of your side, I think that you would expect this to be the case, then all of the local units that were first a part of the army of the LPR or the armies of the DPR, they would be integrated into the Russian military, which could be a good thing for them because they'd probably get better equipment and supplies and rations and stuff like that. So that could potentially help with their morale, especially for the LPR, because they specifically have recently been suffering from lower morale, whether it be from the Kharkov front or from the fact that they're being sent to fight in areas not necessarily within their own territory. So that could be a good thing for them. In addition, Denis Pushilin, he said that the DPR, they continue to have the same name if they were integrated into Russia, but they'd have some changes to their constitution. And we could actually get some data about the polling and what the general population in this area thinks about being integrated into Russia. So these polls, they come from the Crimean Republican Institute of Political and Sociological Research. So take whatever they say with a grain of salt, but this is interesting. 94% of the people polled in the DPR area, they said they support the joining Russia. Then in the LPR, it was 93%. In Kherson, it was 80%, and then in Zaporizhzhia, it was 87%. So let's say these numbers are true. That could be because, one, a lot of the pro-Ukraine residents in the area fled as refugees early on. So you really have more of the pro-Russian people in the area. Or it's just that there are a lot of ethnic Russians and people who speak the Russian language, or people who are just a part of this Russian milieu as they grew up, and they just would support joining Russia. That's entirely possible, especially in DPR and LPR areas. Although I was not aware that in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia there were such large amounts of ethnic Russians. But we did see how a huge percent of their residents wanted to get Russian passports or citizenship. So, regardless of that fact, a lot of them probably want to join. Another thing that I'm interested to hear about is what will happen to all the people that are still living under Ukrainian control within these oblasts that are going to hold referendums. So, the best example of this is Zaporizhzhia, because over here you have the capital of the region, Zaporizhzhia, obviously, which is still under Ukrainian control. And at least the pre-war population was 750,000. So all these people won't really be able to vote in the referendum, so they won't really have a say in this. I'm thinking maybe afterwards, if the Russians are able to capture this area, maybe there'll be some additional referendum, or they'll just be integrated and that'll be the end of it. But you do have a huge chunk of the population in Zaporizhzhia which is not going to be included in this referendum because Russia does not control most of it. The city itself, they control most of the oblast, like 70% of it. According to the Zaporizhzhia officials, there will be over 500,000 voters eligible to vote, and they set up 394 polling stations. So yeah, in Donetsk, this is another issue because about a third of it is still under Ukrainian control, and you have some like huge population centers that are still under Ukrainian control in this area. Although I'd say a lot of it is depopulated, like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, even Bakhmut now. But the thing is, I'm wondering what happens to all the people that left Donetsk and are now outside of it. It seems as if the Russian election commission, they're gonna try to set up some accommodations for the refugees if they're actually displaced from DPR territory, but they're still under a pro-Russia territory, whether it be like Kherson or Zaporizhzhia or LPR or Russia proper. So those people could probably vote in the referendum. But if you're a refugee that's in Ukrainian controlled territory, then there's probably no way for you to vote in this referendum. So all of those people, they won't be able to have a say in this. In terms of Lugansk, all of Lugansk is really under the control of the LPR forces besides Bilohorivka. So there's not much to worry about there. Bilohorivka is probably depopulated anyway. And interestingly, there was no referendum in the Kharkov area, which does make sense because only like 5% of Kharkov is under Russian control. And the same could be said about Mykolaiv. We didn't hear anything about a referendum in Mykolaiv. You can't really hold a referendum with like a few, like tens of thousands of people, when the entire oblast has over 1 million people. So, in addition to all of this, we heard a lot about Russia's internal politics today. And there were some pretty interesting laws that were introduced in the Duma and that are now being sent over to the Russian Senate. It's called the Russian Federation Council. So, the law that I'm talking about specifically says that people who refuse service, so either it's like they got conscripted or their reserves that are being called up now, they're being summoned to serve, or whether it be somebody who's like a contractor who is obligated to fight, if they just refuse to fight, like a desertion, for instance, then they could face up to 10 years in prison and they'd be sent to a penal colony. And that's not the only infraction or the only violation. that could get you in prison. In addition, looting could get troops imprisoned, and also treason, which could be interpreted as like surrendering to Ukraine or as like actively collaborating with the Ukrainian forces after surrender. I'm not really sure about that. There's about a bit of ambiguity in that regard. But these are some pretty interesting laws to be passed on the same day as the announcement of the referendums. And it does spark a debate about whether there will be a general mobilization of Russian forces. It seems as if it won't happen yet, at least according to Russian officials. Specifically, Andrei Kartapalov, he said that there will be no general mobilization, and he's the head of the Committee for Defense in the Duma, so he has a good understanding of the situation in Russia. But it is possible that it happens later. Something that has been theorized is that, let's say all of these oblasts are integrated into Russia, and then Ukraine has some sort of attack in this region to try to reclaim the territory. It would be a good way to start general mobilization. It would be a good casus belli for expanding the war in general. So that's something to look into. But I think the more likely thing that will happen is that you'll just have more reserves called in, because Russia does have about 2 million reservists, and they have about 850,000 active personnel that are just scattered out across Russia in their specific military districts or in different countries or along the borders of enemy countries. So they can be sent to the front line. Another interesting thing to note is that it was reported that the Wagner Group, they were able to recruit about 8,000 prisoners, like actual Russian prisoners, to be contractors for them in the war effort. And we actually have a video of the head of Wagner Group, Pirogzhin, in some prison over here, trying to convince the prisoners to join up for like a 6-month contract, which would be in return for pay and also freeing them from prison. So there is a pretty good incentive for recruiting them and for them signing up. In total, there are about 460,000 people in the Russian prison system. Obviously, not all of them are fit for combat, but there's probably a good amount that could be sent in and would want to, given the conditions in the Russian prisons, they'd want to fight on the front lines and work their way out of the prison system. So it seems as if Russia is doing everything not to mobilize. They're doing basically everything to scrape the barrel before the final option would be to mobilize. So I don't see it happening anytime soon, to be honest. But certainly, Russia is planning to escalate their war effort in some way, because originally it was designated as a special military operation, and this comes with a lot of constraints which were very evident during the first 6 months of the war. We haven't seen Russia go all out, actually striking the command posts in Kiev. We haven't seen them destroy a lot of the bridges along the Dnieper River. There's a lot of electric plants and power stations that are still standing even after Russia launched those strikes over the past week or so. So all of that could be on the table potentially. And we are seeing Russia start to ramp up production. Putin, he asked the heads of the defense industry and all these companies like Almaz Anti, which is responsible for air defense systems, and United Aircraft Corporation, which produces airplanes, and Tactical Missiles Corporation, which produces missiles. He told all of those companies to ramp up production specifically now. He had a meeting with them like 14 hours ago, something like that. And in the law that was passed by the Duma and is now being deliberated upon by the Russian Senate, there's a provision that says that the heads of companies that actually refuse to renew their contracts with the Russian military would be arrested and sent to the penal colonies as well. So any sort of like groups in the defense industry, any sort of company that doesn't comply with increasing production to help sustain the war effort, they would be in danger. So that's a very interesting sign. And we also have in Belarus talks of Lukashenko beginning to actually enact defensive preparations in the event of a war. And we do know that the Belarus armed forces, they've been training for all of September. They've been conducting a lot of drills throughout the country. So they're certainly prepared for whatever happens, and they have some like defense obligations to Russia. So it's possible that if the situation really spirals out of control with Ukraine, Belarus would also get involved. And in Belarus, they have about like 62,000 active personnel and about 350,000 reserves. So that's not too much, but it is notable. And if Belarus were to actually join in, there are a whole host of scenarios that would be open to Russia. They would be able to send newly mobilized troops if that was a part of their strategy to push into Volyn Oblast. But again, a full scale mobilization would take months, which is why it's not like a good short term solution at the moment if the entire goal was to um, get all of the oblasts integrated into Russia and then just finally get the situation over with. It's a very long term solution to mobilize, and it would take a while to get all the training and the production ready, which is why I'm not sure that's going to happen. There are better alternatives for Russia at the moment. But that's really all I have to say at the moment. Last thing is something that I find pretty funny. The US actually threatened additional sanctions against the Russian Federation if they were to go forward with the referendums and integrate all of the oblasts into Russia proper. So I just found that pretty funny because what other sanctions are there to enact? So that's it for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.